Yorkshire, when it came to military bombing targets of the Second World War, was prime. JBS Haldane in 1938 wrote that there was half a square mile of Sheffield which is more vital to the production of munitions than any other part of Britain. This might be an exaggeration, but it has a grain of truth in it. One Sheffield factory, Vickers, was for a time the only place in the country which made crankshafts for the Spitfire. Indeed, so crucial did the Germans believe Sheffield to be that when they bombed it in December 1940, over 600 people were killed and 40,000 made homeless. From 1940 to 1945, over 1,200 people were killed in Hull alone. But whilst, from a strategic point of view, places like Sheffield and Hull made sense as targets because of their military and industrial value, there was one bombing campaign in Britain which was, from the get-go, intended to deliberately cause as much civilian and cultural damage as possible. Known as the Baedeker Raids, these towns and cities had little to no strategic value. Nevertheless, they were targeted, and today we're going to look at just one, the York Blitz. So join me as we look at this part of Yorkshire's hidden history. York, during the early years of the war, was a rather sleepy city. It was surrounded by a ring of airfields, but by and large the city itself sat and watched the war go by. Servicemen from the neighbouring airfields often visited, with Betty's becoming very popular among them. So popular, in fact, that it was featured in a Tatler cartoon in 1944, and soon developed a bit of a reputation. As Charles Whiting wrote, Betty's Cafe started to get a fast reputation, with the free-spending Canadian air crews, who might well die violently on the morrow, wanting to live, and live fast. Good girls didn't go to Betty's anymore. He also describes how the Polish airmen were all clicking heels and hand kisses, very gallant men indeed, especially with the ladies. Compared to the rest of Yorkshire, York was having a jolly old time of it. There were some preparations made in York, of course. There was a home guard, and the city was used for defensive training, and there were 36 public bomb shelters in the city centre. But the city itself was considered to be so safe that some of the children were evacuated from London and sent to live in York. This wasn't a blasé attitude, the belief that nothing bad could happen. It was simply a calculation based on York's standing as a military target. In fact, so little had happened in the city that the Home Office ordered an inquiry into the costs of the city's civil defence, obviously believing that the money could be better spent elsewhere. That's not to say that nothing ever happened in York. There were some bombs dropped in 1940 and 1941 which claimed a few lives, but the extent of the damage was really rather minor. York was, by and large, generally undefended. The city had a few searchlights, but no anti-aircraft guns or barrage balloons. Unbeknownst to both the Germans and many of the residents, however, the city did actually make considerable contributions to the war effort through hidden factories. Some of Rowntree's chocolate factories had secretly been converted to fill explosive shells. Terry's chocolate factory was used to manufacture aircraft propeller blades. The Germans, believing these naturally to only be chocolate factories, left them alone, but had they bombed them, there could have been unprecedented damage caused. In response to the destruction wreaked during the Blitz, the British issued the Area Bombing Directive, which authorised attacks on German civilian cities. In March 1942, the British bombed the German port of Lübeck, the first major attack on a German city. The raid killed 300 people and caused significant damage to cultural sites like the cathedral. Hitler then sanctioned bombing campaigns on British cultural targets. Named after a popular German tourist book, the Baedeker Guide, these attacks were carried out on places like Exeter, Bath, Canterbury and York. It was Tuesday the 28th of April, 1942. At the air raid post on Scarcroft Road, the men on duty couldn't sleep. One of them finally said, "Lads, I've a funny feeling that we're going to cop it tonight." The others agreed and they decided to stay awake. In Penn House, close to where the poet W.H. Auden was born, Grace Jenkins couldn't sleep either. Her brother, who was in the RAF, had told her that a moonlit night like this one was a bomber's moon. She was suddenly seized with a strange sense of apprehension and foreboding. On the moonlit streets, 3 men walked, enjoying a bottle of whiskey. They passed the gates of St. Peter's School, and one of them, who was in fact its headmaster, joked, "It would be a lovely night for a reprisal raid, wouldn't it?" Another, named Colonel Inez Ware, groaned and said they'd like to get a good night's sleep. They chatted some more before going home their separate ways. At around 2:30 on the morning of the 29th, 40 German bombers approached the city. In their briefing, they'd been told to follow the silver snake of the River Ouse as it wound its way up to York. Violet Rogers, who was an assistant at what is now York Castle Museum, was woken up by a large thud somewhere in Clifton. The air raid sirens began to wail and she sprung out of bed, grabbed her helmet and found her colleague, Dr. Alice Lewis. They ran down the road to their medical station at Burtonstone Lane, where they would soon deal with the flood of wounded. Violet said that the road was lit up by the strange and natural glare of magnesium from the incendiaries burning on the roofs everywhere. Grace Jenkins, meanwhile, could see that the gardens of the hospital opposite were ablaze with lights, just like fairy lights. It was fascinating, almost beautiful. Colonel Inez Ware left his house and cycled to Bootham. As the head air raid warden for that area, the welfare and the response to the raid was his responsibility. As he passed, he saw St. Peter's School ablaze. A veteran of the First World War, he knew that these firebombs would soon be followed by high explosives. The German pilots had been briefed to destroy the train station and the rail line, as this would halt traffic throughout the north, especially to Hull, which sent supplies to Russia as part of the Arctic convoys. Meanwhile, an express train from London had just arrived in the station. Suddenly, bombs crashed through the roof, shattering the glass and setting the station ablaze. Station foreman William Milner was killed after entering a burning building to get a box of medical supplies to treat casualties. Nearby, a Rowntree's warehouse, which was filled thankfully with sugar and not explosive shells, blazed fiercely. Out of the darkness came hurricane fighters. A Free French pilot named Yves Mahe downed a Junkers bomber. "I gave the Hun a good taste of his own medicine and his fire ceased," he was later quoted as saying. In 90 minutes, the bombers had dropped over 84 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs. Over 1,000 air raid precaution, civil defence, national fire and other emergency services had responded to the raid. Charles Whiting writes, "Out of the back door of the Mary Wansford's home in Bootham, a determined 91-year-old Mrs. Martin led the other inhabitants in a slow, frightened crocodile past what is now BBC York to the relative safety of Gilligate." All the old ladies remembered the Zeppelins which had flown over York in 1916, but they had seemed relatively harmless. Now, in the last years of their lives, they were experiencing the full, terrifying force of modern war. Ignoring the fires all about and the shrapnel hissing lethally through the air, she set about comforting her friends, marooned in this little island of comparative safety, while the killing went on. When the bombing stopped, people began to emerge from the rubble of their houses. Over a third of all homes in York had been damaged. Mrs. Sachs, who managed a communal kitchen in Aldwark, left the wreck of her house with a blanket covering her dust-covered clothes. The restaurant had been set up by the Ministry of Food to ensure that working people could enjoy a hot meal every day, and she knew that now there'd be thousands of hungry, homeless people in the city. She immediately set to work. By the end of that week, 14,000 lunches and 2,800 breakfasts had been served to the people of the city. At the back of Clifton Cinema, rescuers were frantically digging under the rubble. Eventually, after 7 hours, a weary but triumphant woman emerged, clutching her screaming baby. The Reverend Harry Radcliffe, curate of St Olave's, wandered around the wreckage in Bootham as an air raid warden when an angry voice suddenly snapped, "Get off me legs!" Looking down, he could just make out a figure under the rubble. "Bloody well hurry up and get me out," the trapped man demanded. Radcliffe frantically dug away at the bricks to free the old codger, who didn't have a word of thanks to say to him for his efforts. He later discovered that the old codger had stolen his wallet. Mr. Myers, who owned a house at the corner of Grantham Drive, staggered out in a daze to find a £1,000 bomb embedded in his garden. "I've got summat in my garden," he shouted to a group of local wardens. Almost every street in the city centre had been damaged. The art gallery and Guildhall were burning. When London's Guildhall had been gutted in 1940, York's became the oldest in the country. St Martin le Grand Church was almost totally gone. As Violet Rogers emerged from her medical station, she caught sight of the medieval pile of Bootham Bar, gleaming white and undamaged in the sunlight. It was a symbol of endurance, the continuity between the ancient city's long past and certainty of the future. A reporter from the Yorkshire Observer recorded the beautiful spires of the undamaged minster against a blue sky, a tired-looking girl serving buns and bread over a confectionery counter, bombed out of her home 6 hours before. Tradespeople sweeping away glass splinters into neat piles outside their shops. The cheerful faces and the bustle of the streets. He also came across one woman who was bombed and refused to leave her home until she found a duster to clean up with. People laughing and talking about their experiences. They might have been a holiday crowd walking out in the sunshine. I've seen people looking much less happy at Blackpool. But the human cost of the Blitz was severe. There are some variances in the casualty numbers, but the most reliable source I found lists 110 people, both civilians and members of the various military and emergency services, as dying during the bombing, with over 200 injured. Violet Rogers later became the curator of York Castle Museum. Yves Mahe was later awarded the French Military Cross by General de Gaulle and had further thrilling adventures in the war. I interviewed a York resident who recalled that sometime in 1942, while she was a 2-year-old in a pram, her mother was walking with her through Melrose Gate when she saw a lone German plane flying overhead. This was in the daytime and no siren had sounded, so it was likely a pilot who had gotten lost and flown over the city. She saw the swastika and knew it was German, and it flew so close to the ground that she could see the pilot, and the pilot was looking straight at her. She could even see his goggles, and though she thought right then that he was going to open fire on her and kill her, he didn't. He just flew away. Whether it was seeing her with a pram, or for some other reason, something made the pilot spare her, and it took her a good few days to recover from the experience. In the story of the York Blitz, we get tales of tragedy juxtaposed against tales of individual heroism and resilience. I want to end by showing some then and now pictures created by Malcolm Brooke, and if you'd like to find out about the Blitz in more detail, I would highly recommend visiting his website in the description. Thanks for watching this episode of Yorkshire's Hidden History. I hope you've enjoyed this video, I hope you've learnt something new, and hope to see you again soon.